And I think about it as a triangle model, and health has to be the foundation of that triangle. It has to be the base. It's that foundation of health that then gives us that platform for performance.
Welcome to the M26 FIT Podcast, where we explore the connection between having a strong mind and a strong body.
Right, today's special guest is Dr Kellie Rose, Doctor of Exercise Science, Executive Women's Health Coach, former performance scientist at the Queensland Academy of Sports, and the Head of Sports Science for the Swiss High Performance Program. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Magnus.
Now, that's a pretty impressive bio. Is it true that you've also been referred to as a health ninja?
Yes, a couple of times. Yep, I can own that one.
Yeah, fantastic. Another milestone for the M26 FIT Podcast. You are the first doctor that we're having on the show, so Thank you. Now, what exactly is a Doctor of Exercise Science?
So essentially, a doctorate is a postgraduate degree. It's a Doctor of Philosophy, and you can major in many different areas. So I majored in exercise science, and essentially it's 3 to 4 year degree, and it's all research based. So you have a topic and you deep dive into that research, and the idea is that you push that whole field forward in some way. So you get you write a big thesis, massive thesis that sits on your bookshelf forevermore, but you also get publications out of that as well, journal publications. So yeah, that is a doctorate degree, 4 years of my life.
4 years postgraduate. So you've already done 4, 5, 6 years and then a further 4, is that right?
That's right. So my bachelor degree was also majoring in exercise science. I was a Bachelor of Human Movement Studies, and that was a 4-year degree, undergraduate. And then, yes, I went back to back. So I started straight away into the PhD program, and I was doing that part-time and full-time. So it was actually across 5 years for me. So yeah, it was about 9 years of study.
A lot of study. Tell us about, let's start with the early years in your life. What was life like for you, and what were you like as a young girl growing up?
Well, I was described as an obstinate and headstrong toddler. I think that stubborn streak has really stayed through. I was really shy, actually, really shy, introverted, the bookworm, high achiever at school. But I also love sport, and I think sport was my outlet. And so for as long as I can remember, I've been active, and I used to just follow my mum around to all of her activities for as long as I can remember. Everything from running to gym to aerobics, touch football, everything just developed my love for it.
So that's interesting. So you're both book smart and sporty.
Yes. It's quite a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I was a little bit more sporty, but certainly not book smart, but that's all right.
Well, I get told often I'm book smart, not street smart, which is pretty accurate.
What about, do you have any childhood memories or experiences that you think have helped shaped who you are today?
I think so. I guess the child of divorced parents. So that happened when I was really young. I was 6 years old, I think. So I grew up in, blended families. I have step parents, step siblings, half siblings, full sibling. So there's 6 of us. And I think just growing up in that environment just became really independent from a young age, very headstrong still. And I think I've always known my own mind. I knew, what I wanted and to pursue out of that. So yeah, I would say that independence is probably the biggest thing.
Yeah. So were you private school or public school?
I was a public school girl.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Down in the Bayside of Brisbane, Capalaba State High School. And yeah.
What about uni? Where'd you go to uni and what did you study?
I was at university in Brisbane here at the University of Queensland, and so I did both my bachelor and my doctorate degree at UQ.
Yeah, so from a sporting perspective, because I know that you're a bit of an amateur athlete, certainly a competitive one, what first got you involved in sports and fitness? Seriously.
Yeah. Look, I think it's always been part of my life since that early age. Just I thought nothing of it. It's just living that active lifestyle, and I think it was that outlet. It focused my determination and drive and channeled into sport, and that's developed in so many different ways. So through school, I was always involved in the athletics and all of the different school sports. A distance runner, cross country were my favourites throughout high school. I played on rep teams, state teams, and then none of that was really serious. I think it was probably when I was in university in my bachelor degree, I started doing more distance running, and I did my first half marathon with a friend. And I think that's when I really went into the endurance sports. And a few years later, during my doctorate, a friend of mine got me involved in her triathlon squad. And that was it for me. I was hooked. Triathlon is just this insane sport. It requires so much dedication and commitment, and you just live and breathe it, which I think suited my all or nothing nature. Like it just really was, pivotal in my life. And I was doing, of course, the long distance stuff as well. So the 70.3, the half Ironman distance. And that was probably the most competitive I got. I was doing the national circuit at one point, and world championships as an age grouper, traveling around the world for that as well as around Australia. And yeah, that was a good while, up until my late 20s, I think. And then sort of that shift in the career, got more serious and took over.
So that shift in the career, what were you doing at the time when you were late 20s, work-wise?
Late 20s. So at 28, I moved to Europe alone for a job, moved solo across to the other side of the world, sold everything I owned, packed up a few suitcases and took off. And that's when I moved to Switzerland, and I was working over there. And so, obviously a little bit more intense in that role. So
that was that Swiss Olympic high performance team? Is that what you were looking after over there?
It was. So it was an interesting situation. So I was based in the south of Switzerland, in the only Italian province called Ticino. Not many people know that there's an Italian province, but we were on the Italian border, quite close to Milan. And down there, it's a lot warmer. So we were looking at setting up a satellite high performance centre down there for the Swiss Federal Institute of Sport. So they were my employer. So I guess very similar to the Australian Institute of Sport, Australian Sports Commission.
Okay. And what was your objective and your main role down there?
It was quite varied. It was quite a big role. So I was brought over to set up this, essentially this satellite high performance centre with sports science, sports medicine and infrastructure around that for their summer sports federations. So Swiss Swimming was a major resident federation there. And then over time we had another couple come on board. But really we were looking at, setting up that infrastructure perspective. But then I also had another foot in the Swiss swimming camp where I was the sports scientist and, practitioner in that sense, but also the sports science manager for the training base and the national team. So I was very hands-on. I was on pool deck. I was doing the testing. I was doing the traveling, the training camps, the competitions, the analyses. So all of that. As well as, being the, performance manager of that, that infrastructure. We got it to a really great place at the end. So I had that system around me. So it was quite a big objective. I'm not sure I ever had a position description in that whole time. I think it would have just said everything. There was a lot going on. Yeah. But it was really modelled off the Australian system. So that's one of the main reasons why I was brought over to do that job, because they knew how the Australian system ran, particularly with swimming at that time. And so me having worked in that, it was my job at the time before I moved over there. Bringing that knowledge and sort of, constructing something similar that worked for their environment.
Yeah. And were you still training, still doing triathlon when you were over in Switzerland?
No, I actually didn't take my bike with me. So I was, for the first time in a long time, without a bike for about a year until I bought one. And I did in 2014 one of the half Ironmans in Zurich, but that was the only one. It was just really difficult because over there, apart from the workload, the scope of that being really high, I was also on the road so much traveling. We were traveling to training camps and competitions. I was with the juniors team, the senior team. So yeah, it was really a life on the road for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
So it just became running. Running is easy.
Sounds like a pretty full-on job that you were doing, which obviously led to your burnout. So before we get into the detail of that burnout, do you mind just explaining for us what the clinical definition is of burnout? Because it's not the same as stress-related, some of the stress-related mental health issue, is it?
It's a combination of both. It's the physical manifestation and definitely the mental health manifestation. But in 2019, actually, the World Health Organization classified burnout in their International Classification of Diseases as a syndrome. And they say it's a syndrome conceptualized as chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So firmly putting it in the organisational sphere and stemming from that chronic stress as the main risk factor. But importantly, it's not a medical condition, so that makes it tricky. You can't technically medically diagnose burnout. And so you have to go by, symptomology. And so for burnout to be in place, there are 3 dimensions of burnout that have to occur. And they are exhaustion, cynicism, and professional inefficacy. And then there are 6 causes and contributors to those that map to the 3 dimensions. But yeah, they're really, those 3 dimensions have to be in place. So, I grit my teeth when I hear, I was burnt out on Monday. And it's like, well, actually, it's more chronic than that. Yeah. It's a persistent state.
And obviously both men and women can suffer from it. Are there any differences there systematically, symptom-wise?
You're correct. Both men and women do experience burnout, for sure. Currently, the prevalence is much higher in women. And so all of those dimensions and those causes, they are universal, whether you're male or female. And so in that sense, in the contributors and the causes of burnout, they can be very similar. There are nuances, particularly in the workplace, additional stressors for women that can be contributors to that. But then when it comes to symptomology, again, that can be quite universal in how it sort of plays out in that mental health and the physical health and the symptoms that we have. But I would say the difference with women comes down to that hormones and the physiology. So we know that the stress hormones, particularly when they're in that chronic state, they can interact with our reproductive hormones that cycle and fluctuate monthly. And so this can interact and compound that and have an additional impact on that physical health and the mental health symptomology. So it adds a layer of complexity.
When did you first start realising that you were showing symptoms from burnout?
To be honest, I didn't, Magnus. I didn't know what burnout was when this all happened. So this was about 9 years ago. And back then, burnout wasn't a thing. Nobody was talking about burnout. I certainly had no idea what it was. There just wasn't the conversation around it. And so I certainly knew and I could see that my health and my physical and my mental health was sort of, degrading, but I never thought it would get to the state that it did. And I guess I thought that if I did admit that there was something wrong with my health, that I couldn't continue. because for me, you know, I guess at the time as well, I was in that state. I was young, I was ambitious, I was driven in my career. I was that high-functioning, high-performing, typical person. And I'd been brought to the other side of the world to do a job. And I didn't want to quit and not do that job. And so I think there was a level of not wanting to admit it, that something was actually wrong.
So wasn't that no specific events or pressures that you can recall that sort of that triggered it for you?
It was a long process, which burnout often is. You know, it's like that sort of frog in the boiling water analogy that because it's stress is at the heart of it, and stress is adaptive, it can also be maladaptive. And so we don't realise just how far we're getting away from our normal. And so for me, it was, and most people, it's multiple stressors over a long period of time. And if I was to think back on my situation and the contributors without going into like every little like stressor in that workplace, I would have ticked all of the boxes of textbook burnout from those 3 dimensions and the 6 causes, you know, the overload, the lack of control, the reward, the recognition, the sense of community, the values, that sort of thing. So all of that was in place, of course. But then I think mine was quite a unique situation. There were multiple big factors at play. So I mentioned that, you know, from an organisational perspective, that just put me into a state of that overload, the overwork. It was quite an unhealthy, sort of toxic environment there. I was navigating a foreign federal government system, the politics, the bureaucracy, the red tape that involves, and then one of the only female leaders in that environment and managers. So we know they're all contributors. So that was the work sphere that was going on every day for me. And then from a personal side, I was on the other side of the world, alone, quite isolated. I didn't have my social networks, my friends, my family, people who knew me that would see something was wrong and that I could lean on. And the couple of close friends I did have in Switzerland, they were in other cities on the other side of the country, so not very accessible. But then the third factor, and really important, is my own responsibility for my health. I didn't take responsibility for my health early enough and prioritize that. And being in that state, it really, I guess, just worsened that whole situation. When you're not at your own capacity and you're functioning suboptimally, it just makes everything else worse.
So it was years for you? So it was a period of years versus months, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah. It was.
Do you remember, was there a pivotal time when you knew that you hit rock bottom and you needed help?
There were 2. One was a personal wake-up call and one was a public sort of wake-up call. So if I can share these sort of stories with you. So the first one, I was alone at home. It was nighttime. And as you sometimes do, I found myself crying on my bathroom floor in the cold and dark. Not actually sure how I got there, but just absolutely depleted, and, you know, that physical, that mental, that emotional sort of components really just coming through. And I remember standing up eventually and looking in my bathroom mirror and not even recognising the face that was looking back at me. It was just like looking at this zombie, and it was really disconcerting. And, you know, that's that depersonalization that we see in that, you know, that component of burnout. And then the public one was just after that and quite near the end. So I was actually on holidays in Portugal with one of my best friends who had flown over for the European summer, and we were there for a week. And Magnus, I don't really remember that holiday whatsoever. I have snapshots of it. I was so exhausted that I slept most of it. I slept until probably midday, and then I would wake up for a couple of hours. We'd totter down to the beach where I would face plant on the sand and sleep for another 2 or 3 hours. I was just so far gone. And of course that was quite public. My friend was there and she saw how I was, functioning or not functioning. And I think that was really the beginning of the end. That was when I started, I went home back to Switzerland, and that's when the doctor's visits and the hospital visits and the tests all began to really try and figure out what was actually wrong. So it started that process.
Yeah. So what did they do? So you've fronted up in hospital, because that must have been pretty awful. And considering that before you left for Switzerland, back in Australia, you're a high performing athlete, and to find yourself on the floor of the bathroom and then not being able to recognise yourself must have been a big shock for you personally to be able to deal with that.
It was, and it's something that is still with me to this day, 9 years later, because it hit me so hard, and it really was the biggest wake-up call I've probably ever had, not to ever get back to that place ever again, not to ever put myself in hospital again. And that was one of the biggest things that come from this, was that, that shame and that guilt that I had contributed to that. It's, 2 people in that party, and, I had to take responsibility for that. And that was really scary, and a really life-changing moment.
So you wound up in hospital, like your symptoms were that bad that you've wound up in hospital, and they started doing a bunch of medical tests. Is that correct?
That's correct. As I said, 9 years ago, they went at it at a very medical process, and particularly in Switzerland there, that was their medical system. So I was seeing every different type of specialist, and then of course you never get a holistic view of what's actually going on when you go piecemeal. And so we were doing tests because I had so much pain and problems manifesting that we were trying to get to the bottom of that. And it actually wasn't until I came home, I think it was towards the end of the year, so I came home over the Christmas period and saw some medical practitioners here in Australia, that we actually put the whole picture together of what was actually going on with the whole fatigue and the stress and my work life and my personal life and how I was operating. Did a couple of additional tests, and then that was basically it. They uttered the word burnout for the first time, which I still didn't know what it was.
Yeah. So then that commenced the recovery process. So can you walk us through that? What did that look like for you, and how long did it take?
It did start the recovery. I think, coming back to what I said before, it was just absolutely life-changing, and I don't say that lightly. It was a complete life 180 in the way that I was living my life, and it had to be, because what I was doing was not going to get me to where I wanted to go in a healthy way. And so, everything turned on its head. My work, the way that I was performing and operating at work, the way I was taking care of my own health. And so it was really that acute phase, I would say, was about 12 months, that acute phase of recovery. And that was because it had persisted for so long, and I think my burnout was so intense and severe. I had some autoimmune conditions that come from that because, I pushed myself so hard in the manifestation of stress. So there was, getting across and through that, but also there were no treatment plans for burnout back then. So again, everything, I didn't have a practitioner helping me. It was a lot of self-guidance. So, that's probably why it took a while. But I would say that whole process took probably at least 4 years altogether to really get back to 100% health, where I was that health resilience and robustness that I could still be a high performer at work. I went into having my business soon after that, and also be able to train and be active to the way that I wanted without, continually breaking in that cycle. And so that process, it was a bit self-guided. There were a few signposts at the beginning like, do this and this, but then everything else was on my own and my own knowledge. And I had to go through a big process. Firstly, managing proactively managing my own stress levels, because that just doesn't go away, right? Like you have to wind that back. I started yoga and meditation for the first time in my life. That was difficult.
Did it help?
It did. It was actually really therapeutic because it was such an emotional time. It was actually where all of my emotions around that, the trauma of that situation came out and came through. So that was really therapeutic. The meditation, I mean, I admit to being the monkey mind for 5 minutes, and that was excruciating. But then now it's a practice to this day that I actually really love, and it's a tool in my toolkit that I use and lean into for sure. We made friends in the end, meditation and I. But then I had to get, longer term processes. I was insomniac, so I had to really repair my sleep. I had really severe brain fog, problems concentrating, the focus and everything that is common with burnout and stress. My mental health wasn't in a really good place. I think, looking back, I see the signs of depression and anxiety. Definitely. I look back now and I was like, well, I was actually having anxiety attacks quite regularly. So working through that, also healing the gut problems that I had. So I said, a couple of autoimmune conditions, and then reducing the exercise load. So this is something that I really didn't like at the time, but I had to, because as much as we love exercise and movement is great, I didn't stop moving, but I had to stop exercising the way that I was, doing all this, competitive stuff. I had to pull back on that because it's a stressor as well. And I think sometimes we forget that in that high intensity.
To put that in perspective though, for our listeners, that's not that I'm going to the gym for an hour in a week, because when you're competing, you're talking about how many hours a week that you were training for a triathlon, for example.
At the time, ridiculously, I was trying to train for my first marathon. So I was also overtraining myself because I was at such a low capacity. So obviously I was running a lot of Ks, or trying to at least, and I was just burying myself in the ground. And looking back, I'm so thankful and so lucky that I didn't get any heart problems from that, overexerting myself.
Yeah. So speaking of looking back, and you mentioned hindsight, so when you sit here now and you look at that whole situation over in Switzerland, everything that you went through, were there any particular points or triggers that you can see now that, hey, that should have been a wake-up call, or that should have been a wake-up call for you from a prevention perspective? Or what actions could you have potentially taken, do you think?
I definitely think I could have taken action earlier. So I guess this is something I've put a bit of thought into going through my own, journey, my own journey, and to unpack it, particularly in the work that I do now. So the first and foremost, always, I would have taken control of my health, taken the responsibility for that. I had so many factors. As I said, you mentioned your earlier question, I was an insomniac. I was so chronically stressed. I spent most of my time doubled over in pain because of my in gut pain. It was just incredible. And so, yes, there were definitely things that I should have got on top of early. So I would take the responsibility for my health and pull that back. And then secondly, I think maybe off the back of that, I would have been really clear from the start on my boundaries in that role. I mentioned how big it was. I wasn't clear on what I was willing to give to it or what I was willing to sacrifice. And so I wasn't clear when I reached that boundary and just powered through it and kept going. So that is definitely something I would do, is get clear on what I'm willing to give to that job. And third, I would have asked for the support and the resources, the assistance, everything that I needed to do that job. I would have done that earlier through the right leadership channels. Look, I eventually did that, but for me, it was too little, too late by the time I got to that point. And I think a lot of that, a theme there is agency. I just didn't exert the agency that I had from a work sense or from a personal sense. And I think that's what we forget. And I see it with clients of mine that we do actually have more control than we think. And if we speak up and communicate and ask, that's at least the first step. Yeah. And then what happens from there, we make another choice.
Boundaries that you mentioned, I think that's a really, really important one that people don't exercise anywhere near often enough. But now you're obviously using that for a positive, that experience and your science knowledge. How are you using that now to help people?
I'm channeling that into my business, Dr Kellie Rose, where I'm working with senior female leaders and executives who feel like they are at that point. They're on that brink of burnout or might already be there and need to go through that recovery process. So I'm using, I guess, the three key parts there: my lived experience of burnout, my science and academic knowledge, and also my lived experience of my practical experience working with high performers at the top of their game internationally. So all of that combined, I bring into my one-on-one private coaching programs where I work with these women for 6 months or 12 months, depending on where they are and what they need. And I now have a systematized process. So we're not blindly stumbling in the dark like I was. I've really put that into a really refined, quite comprehensive process that we work through over that time, very highly individualized. And of course, being a scientist, I have all my clients on the Whoop device where we get their biometric data, all of their health insights, and it really helps us know what's going on physiologically, and then it helps us rebuild that health. So that's the coaching, and that's my love. And then I'm also doing corporate speaking as well. So delivering keynotes and workshops in corporate, really centered on the prevention side of that. Like, I don't want anyone to get to that place that I did. So it's really about equipping leaders with the knowledge and the tools about burnout, what it is, what it looks like, your own signs and symptoms of stress, how you respond. So it's really that awareness place. And then the tools, like what can you do about it? What are the tangible strategies that you can take for your situation and your challenge that you can go and implement today? So I'm really big on that actionable takeaways.
You can hear the passion in your voice, and you're all about taking that experience and turning it into something great. That's fantastic. What are some of the early warning signs some of our listeners might be able to, that you could share with us?
Sure. I'll center it on the 3 dimensions of burnout, because this is really how you're ticking those boxes. So I mentioned exhaustion as the first one. Now, this is key and usually is present in most burnout cases that I see, particularly knowledge workers that overload burnout. So exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional. Your batteries are empty before you even start the day. You really can't recover well. So across a weekend or a week off is just not replenishing you. So it's really just this, you're completely drained. The second one is that cynicism and depersonalization. So this is a bit of a big one, and it's attitudinal and it's behavioral. So with the cynicism, obviously, it's as it says, you have a very cynical, very negative nature, outlook on life. So, and all of this is pervasive. It's not just at work, and yeah, it's cynical, it's negative to clients, to stakeholders, to colleagues, to everybody. And then the second part of that is that depersonalization and that detachment. So we start to disconnect, withdraw, shut down. We're not as social as what we usually are. Maybe we're not collaborating as much at work. Also socially, we're not doing the things that we love and the hobbies and things. So there's 2 parts to that. And I mentioned, that personal experience for me, that was depersonalization, probably to the extreme. But then there's the third component, which is professional inefficacy. And this is where you feel that lack of achievement, lack of accomplishment. You feel like a failure I felt like a failure, that I wasn't doing my job, that I wasn't keeping up with the pace and the demand of the job, that I just didn't have the resources to do that. And you don't love your work anymore. So it's something that, you used to love and now you don't anymore. So that's how it can manifest. That's what it sort of looks like from that sense, in the 3 dimensions. And then there's those physical symptoms of stress as well. So this is really centered on how that chronic stress manifests for us. I mentioned a lot that I experienced. So everything from, muscle pain, joint pain, headaches, migraines, sleep disturbances usually, because there's a bidirectional relationship with sleep and stress. So insomnia is quite common. Emotional outbursts and irritability, so mood changes, mood swings. We have the gut pain is a big one as well. Hormonal fluctuations. For women, you might see changes in your PMS or perimenopausal symptomology worsening and increased frequency. Weight fluctuations and changes from the stress, immune suppression, so you might be getting sick more often. It's really widespread. And then there's obviously the mental side. So depression and anxiety, I said, is linked to both the stress and the burnout.
It's a pretty comprehensive list of things that could be wrong.
It's tricky because it's so individualized, and people, depending on, what your profile of burnout is and what the causes and things are, everyone can manifest a little bit differently. And so you might have some of those symptoms, you might have all of them. But if you are feeling a few, it's definitely a warning sign of stress and that you do need to do something about it.
How important do you think are the fundamentals and the foundations of spending? Our philosophy is that spend 26 minutes every day doing something mindful and some form of physical exercise, as well as just having some good nutrition, trying to get obviously a good night's sleep, as well as hydration. So do you find that is important as well, just to lay that foundation for people, that if you're doing those simple things right every single day and having a little bit of that focus on yourself, that puts you in better stead to be able to handle some of those stresses of life? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And this is how I probably run my life now, and my biggest philosophy with the work that I do. And I think about it as a triangle model, and health has to be the foundation of that triangle. It has to be the base. It's that foundation of health that then gives us that platform for performance. Then we can, at the top of that triangle, we can perform, we can lead. But if we're not healthy, it's questionable whether we're showing up to work. Certainly, probably not in our best state.
Not at 100%.
Not at 100%. And as a leader, as a high performer, that's what's required of us. And so, to me, they're fundamental. It's at the heart of my coaching. I mean, that's everything that I do, is restoring and rebuilding everybody's health so that they do have that capacity to perform where they want to, because inevitably when they come to me, their performance is being impacted as well.
Because one of my favourite sayings is health equals wealth. And I know that you've got a similar saying that if I don't have my health, what I have nothing. What do I have? So very, very much that foundation. And unfortunately, I don't think that people don't. And it's not until you hit that rock bottom and for yourself, you've been there. And then once you've been there, I was just thinking back, you were over there for 3 odd years.
Nearly 6 years.
Yeah. So you're over there for 6 years, and then once you hit rock bottom, it took you 4 years to get back to where you were. Like, that's a long time.
It was. So I ended up resigning from that role eventually when I saw that that situation was just perpetuating. So I made that decision for myself to resign. But then I stayed in Switzerland working for a couple of other organisations as well. And so, that recovery period continued through while I was in Switzerland, and then also when I returned back to Australia. So I still wasn't at full health when I got back here.
No. So what's the best advice that you could give our listeners?
It would be to prioritize your health. Like, nothing is more important than your health. And I think too often we get wrapped up in our own importance, and I was guilty of that, you know, and it come down, if I could sum it up, it's probably you're replaceable, but your health isn't. So we think that, and I'm speaking from myself here, that, you know, they can't do, you know, they can't operate without us. You know, I need to be there. Everyone's depending on me. You know, this whole thing will fall apart. But at the end of the day, when I left, you know, that job went to a junior. So, you know,
somehow they move on.
Exactly. People move on, and the value that we place on it is different. And I think we're all we're conscientious types, so we like to think that. But yeah, I would say, you know, keep that in mind. People are replaceable, but your health isn't. So what are you willing to sacrifice and give up for your job? And, you know, are you willing to sacrifice your health for that? And the second thing I would say is to cultivate that self-awareness really early. And that's, you know, getting to know yourself, how you operate, what your tendencies are, what your stressors are, how you respond to that stress, healthily or unhealthily. How much can you shift that to a healthy response to stress? Because it's not all negative. So yeah, really just starting to understand yourself, how you operate, how you respond to stress, what your stresses are, and then then you can do something about it.
Well said. Now, quick fire question time. Are you ready?
I am. Let's go.
What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning?
Sync my Whoop device.
The most used app on your phone?
My Whoop app by far.
Favorite workout routine?
Trail running and gym at the moment.
What do you love?
Ooh, traveling, coffee, wine, and sports.
Life impacting book that you've read?
Ooh, the most recent, that's hard for a bookworm. The most recent I would say was The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jacku.
Great book. Something we should all do more of.
Move.
Go-to stress relief activity for you?
Walking.
What do you dream about?
Moving back to Europe and living part-time between Europe and Australia.
Well, that's the next one. An overseas city that you could live in?
Ooh, a couple of favourites. Northern Italy, somewhere, maybe around Verona, Barcelona, or maybe Rotterdam.
Nice. Most practical advice that you've ever received?
The most powerful force I have is what I say to myself and what I believe.
Awesome. Favorite quote or saying?
This is a new one that I'm sitting with. Pressure is a privilege. Yeah. Means you're doing something worthwhile, right?
That's right. One thing you can't live without?
My morning coffee.
Favorite way to unwind after a long day?
Sauna and steam room.
The biggest inspiration in your life?
At the moment, I have to say it's my clients and some of these incredible results that they're getting, the transformations I'm witnessing. Honestly, Magnus, it's inspiring me to do more.
Fantastic. The greatest athlete that you follow?
Kate Campbell.
The best part of your job?
Getting to do what I love every day, really. It's my purpose, it's my passion, and I get to make a difference. And yeah, I get paid for it. It's really that ikigai. So I'm so lucky.
How good. All-time favourite movie?
Oh, anything romance. The epic love stories get me every time. I'm a soppy romantic at heart.
What gives you motivation?
From a business sense at the moment, building the business, I want to take it global. I want to, have a global impact, work with female leaders around the world.
If you could change one thing in the world, what would that be?
Changing the way that we operate in our work life and our personal life, and putting health at the center of that, whatever that looks like.
One word to describe yourself.
An optimist. I think I have to be.
All right, last one. Finish this sentence. I believe.
Health is wealth.
Isn't it? Well said.
Absolutely.
What a great way to finish. Thanks so much for your time. Super appreciate you coming in. Love your insights and love what you're doing, giving back to the world. Awesome.
Thank you, Magnus. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, we have a small favour to ask. Please take a moment to subscribe, review, and share this podcast with someone you think will appreciate it. Your support helps us reach more listeners, and we can continue delivering content that educates, inspires, and empowers you. Don't forget to follow us on social media to stay in the loop with all our latest news. 2024 is going to be a huge year, and we'll continue running our weekly Friday morning kayaking sessions on the beautiful Brisbane River, along with plenty more thrilling adventures, exciting activities, and challenges are planned. We'd love for you to join us and be part of our growing community. Remember, success is all about consistency. And by investing 26 minutes exercising both your mind and your body every day, you too can become the strongest, fittest, and healthiest version of you. So stay tuned and stay active.